Check, check, check. Do you want me to put it back off?
Somebody grab the door.
Everyone who wants it should have it. Let me know if you don't.
Honestly, I might get this right when we fall asleep.
We have another one.
Do you have the money seat?
I've never been another bro.
I do. Do you?
1 second. I'm ready.
Are we good? Great.
The advantage of disease, it's a non-linear existential risk encompasses and outweighs other threats as Pamela and Armstrong 15. The risk is probably some symptom of civilization clocks period 17-hour recovery of infinite the result of irreversible period or what's together can happen. Their probabilities increase due to unsustainable trends and tendency to exclude impacts with low probability 5% of reason for their invisibility of infinite impacts. Cultural references to infinite impacts have been dominated by critique industrial society without scientific fact exists. One view that's fundamentally different as focus on scientific evidence or peer-reviewed sources impacts the survival of humanity life on Earth. From an ethical perspective, no possible can outweigh a small probability of many traditional risks, including wars have decreased physiologically based or morally. The response psychological denial, no responsible probability covered approach cannot be trial and error. So take preventive action to the cost moral and economic life risk outside our experience. Collective response by the ill-calibrated threats will become invisible. They occur from the future of occurrence actions on balance system humanity. Develop a long path we can find. We would define morally repellent consequences, not clear cut dependent value judgments that would be contentious and unshared enduring poverty and nevertheless unshared enduring poverty and nevertheless not sufficient to threaten humanity without system class of pandemic worldwide would have the greatest cause of mortality in history. Public historic fatalities real those follow power law. A small exponent those are heavy tail. The majority will definitely single large pandemic such will have a greater probability than the usually same all features usually excess nature incurable fatal incredibly infectious long incubation periods and passion calamities and influence that have demonstrated anti-genetic shift itself will be extremely the world has changed making mass comparisons problematic modern transport dense populational infection that spread rapidly the ripple effect will include political and disruption academic dislocation rate damage trade epidemic fragments human society that extent the recovery is impossible we call for humanity so comes to other risks such as climate further pandemics unpredictable zoonosis creates an invisible brain for new outbreaks that's Rosenberg 17 Ebola SARS-CoV bird flu swine flu less fever Marburg failing a whole range of pathogens can rapidly go from outbreak to epidemic to pandemic these factors ways zoonosis can be eradicated especially kill 50 million the death toll today might even be higher that spread to all capitals and sanctity with mobility population pressures and climate change burnout is wrong for diseases that spread in the U.S. That's part of 16 investor change to transportation escape local extinction there's one of which the entire population does with the increase in global transportation and legislation approaching a critical threshold historical evidence is not a good idea about the transition to extinction is submissive tables high few more long range connections close to the point that the U.S. have highly connected to spread as Africa was much greater race group unstoppable the magnitude of the threat justifies an escalated clause for utilitarian calculations this avoids abuses while ensuring just outcomes at the tail end of risk Kirkwood 9 in pandemics that will harm large numbers public health demands attention to util source limitation worst case scenario right things utils not afford a strong considering its extreme position of modern form needs our actions should increase that goodness however there must be an escalated cause in the event of a threat to existence of a population the greater the threat greater than the use of force the greater the force of util the greater the moral impetus to minimize harm pandemics so fundamentally undermine life this place great responsibilities on those who can raise the body kind of good public health and one of you to in concert with others in extreme cases such equilibrium takes its a heightened obligation intervening at the point of care is key the causes of illness are multiple and can't be resolved with one single action that's Hirschfield in 17th scholar substitute moral argument in place of objective historical research epidemics predicts will configure by human media virulence variables in social environment play a role with overlights and structural bonds raises variation explains all epidemics with one predetermined unfalsifiable layer vaguely defined malevolent structures are resemble 21st century minus my vague course on scientific theory that contributes total understanding raising the threat level is important key to national and international response to disease when combined with our public health response advocacy is demilitarizing that's JV's in 17 for the last 2 decades scientists and let's pay the health security card issue political goal securitization harness global leadership and resource health is a low priority through most nation building because health involves national interest power and diplomatic compromises safe nurses have been critical to agreements and issues of security remain atop the foreign policy hierarchy but security we're not one-dimensional sought to protect individuals and national states who are focused on security as an equal presence of human rights and sovereignty is a responsibility the language security discourse help capture intent was not the only tool of playing neither to displace other discourse operationalization of initiatives about dominant discussion form the framing language small part of discourse compared to consuming discussion of institutional design their key priorities seem to be international initiative to achieve health goals specifically preemptive securitization is key both the 1AC and current security discourses will only be operationalized during a pandemic but starting early primes the public for preventative care and an efficient response Cook 10 Pandemic we multi-sectoral and existential debt to the military, the political, social, and the use of rhetoric makes it possible for disease to disseminate as early as 2000. The government was beginning to identify pandemic as a threat in spite of the concern of public remains more concerned about cost and availability of rapid attention to the use of intermittent when there were new cases integrating rapidly with disease services team contained pair subject for highest early stage of outbreaks. There has been a lack of acceptance of serious usage by the public lead actors engaged in signaling in anticipation of future securitizing moves of actors make a securitizing move, engage in a few extraordinary racial health issue, return to the previous agenda, have our actors invoking security, the intent of security, right, accept this nature, a crisis in the future, accepting a precedent of this could eventually be securitized through the action of a policy window that allows limited policy making that could be useful in the future pandemic and improved preparation for dealing with the pandemic before one begins, increasing efficacy response once it has to be undertaken. Even the most extreme forms of securitization don't cause military interventions. That's so bullet 12. Desperate times do not always require desperate measures. Those who have been invisible and advocating recognition of the threat offer help and in development orders. The recommendations examples include access to medication. None of the advocacy for securitization has included military imposition of isolation and quarantine. The UN declared it to be a threat and at the same time advocating human rights suppression. Important counter-example of the notion that framing an issue in security terms and involves extreme response when it came to that characterization may eventually lead to extreme measures, even if that is not the intention, is at best questionable. Infringing on individual autonomy is justified in this context, even if no other, because disease is a negative externality and because no individual internalizes the cost of spreading it. That's Widows 13. Autonomy is given dominant the however trace is not trouble other concerns. The charge of paternalism negates and silences other claims of contemporary ethics. Those claims on the wholly unsatisfactory balanced governance would be impossible choice. Can never be constrained. All regulation constrained choices. Justice is unethical. It's nonsense. Clearly, common goods are also important. Unless common goods are protected, individuals will suffer. It's not sustainable for each individual. See the percentage of resources they you in for all that have medicine. Group goods are valuable because they have benefited individuals. The assumption of the evil scientists or tyrannical regime become embedded a fear of which legitimate extended illegitimate context where the individual activity actually benefits immunity or global goods. No disease being no respecter of borders, some will be more effective. The poor disease will be more vulnerable. Ultimately, all will suffer. Such goods are supremely valuable. Human survival accordingly they should be prioritized and undo any ethical framework unless collective goods are protected. Survival of the human species will be threatened. The exaggerated fear of paternalism is small when compared to the overall cost compared to concerns about the threat to individual expanded go so far beyond harms that it is absurd worries about curtailing choice or undermining the survival of all. Starting with an understanding of subjectivity as relational rather than atomistic creates an ethical obligation to mitigate healthcare inequalities through a single payer and refuses individualist neoliberal logics. For 17. Autonomy seems to apply in the base so persons as relational beings as harmed by ethical discourse. The notion is successfully individualistic. You can't be human by yourself. We think of ourselves as separate. Whereas what you do affects the whole world. Choices do not only affect themselves, but also impact the community individuals. And whether from an egalitarian left of the market rate to the right people act similar to American bias to area autonomy. Also products of this sort of worldview. Those who challenge may be motivated by negative social and psychological effects, psychological effects related to atomistic tendencies. The modern level society's practice have contributed to the alienation of political, unbounded, agreed loneliness, crime, and increasing inequality with co-commit socialism, which the erosion of communal life. The U.S. must be toward the common good of the U.S. be more open and universal coverage of the principles where emphasize more autonomy, less even strong individuals, communities really do not think autonomy is all that matters. So for a person to reflect what is important far better than autonomy plan. The United States federal government should establish a system in which healthcare providers are paid for their services by the government. And solvency coverage reduces mortality and financial precarity. That's Gaffney 18 coverage is a protective effect in the quasi-external difference in different studies in most longitudinal studies for it. Not associated with the odds ratio of dying and insured versus uninsured ratio of 2.097. The Oregon study was underpowered because coverage had a beneficial effect on patient health care, access and use of self-rated health, as well as mortality 20 million uninsured producers not acceptable enough undeserved death and suffering. The nation states the only way to provide care effectively. That's rigor 14, meaning health rate needs to repress functioning national system. The nation state is essential roles in raising and distributing revenue, employing policy, and enforcing policy through legal system. The nation states are best positioned to provide systems and services, healthcare, proximal and controllable health determinants. Every person must be able to take care. Stewardship of the health system is critical. Targeting demands for a single payer at the federal government builds cross-cultural solidarity and prevents our gains from being rolled back. Dane Brown 17. The challenge is build a durable organization that can effect real change. Single payer can help us do that. Increase socials, organizing vaccine, build a working class, private long-term struggle. Single folks helps innovate work and is one campaign against a tactic in the service of a larger strategy. Build internal structures and organizing skills among a new generation of grassroots leftist activist single payers. A strategic central focus in fighting. We build solidarity across different and power for the working class. Everybody needs healthcare. Everybody has been hurt by insurance, freedom, political education, posture, shared self-interest. The foundation of a solidarity built to last. Single payer solves disease. One is preventative focus, decreasing financial and procedural barriers to seeking care makes access more likely and patients more likely to report illness. Lady 14. Make a distinction between integrated resources and the guarantees covered by the dedicated funding source. Single payer versus fragmented approach to the response to pandemics. It's governed by private corporations only accountable to their shareholders, understaffing access based on ability to pay technology, difficulty getting admission, have an everyday upload reveals financial inadequacies. Only integration plan resource and authority can protect from pandemic. Central planning is key to solve preventative medicine and research. Can 17 disease emerge in the U.S. and developed countries. Public health fragmented, underfunded. The profit system reaction average rather than taking precautionary approach. The U.S. needs single payer to reorder healthcare priorities from profit care funding of public health systems that includes vector control and emerging disease research and vaccine diagnostics development. This changes the necessary to protect global health and inequalities are tied to infectious disease exploding into full epidemics globally. Second is early detection, encouraging patients to seek care makes outbreak detection faster. That's key to solve emerging outbreaks in the U.S. and breaking the chain of transmission. Con 17, HC would leave 51 million uninsured people placed at healthcare once they seek other less attention. This becomes a danger for the public. So it's intact involves smallpox, not the community waiting for what exposes others, sending off a pandemic piecemeal. Healthcare less able to handle crisis. Only way to prepare for pandemics than by terrorist. Single payer, no circumvention. Brock 17, nationwide insurance program would save billions on admin costs rather than 51 separate systems plus Medicare, Medicaid, Obamacare issues and tax incentives. Even 7 order politicians can place its fingers on the scale. Single payer can be run as a semi-autonomous utility with minimal interference. No rationing either. That's flood and Thomas 17. Single payer such a single have limited wait times within Canada. Those tackling wait times in prior years. A study of federal provinces spread radiation therapy within a benchmark times in the U.S. are comparable with next day form says will especially says the cost hinders timeless where people choose not to seek care or fill prescriptions that the American approach reduces weight through gaps.
Why should we bring questions of ethical obligations to debate?
Questions of ethical obligations to debate. We think that debate should be a site in which we compare proposals for the world, and the only way to assess whether those proposals are good or bad is a system of ethics.
What do you mean by what kind of system of ethics have you supported?
A system
How
of
do you
ethics
define
where
that?
we should maximize the amount of people who are saved from existential risks, specifically in the context of disease. In other contexts, that is a little bit different, but it's like flexible.
So it's just maximum lives saved?
Not always. Our evidence says that disease is a different threat entirely because of its unique probability to harm a majority of the human population and kill everyone on Earth. Our evidence makes a distinction between
Okay, I'm
like
curious
all.
why that's an ethical obligation.
Because what do you mean? Like
Why use the word ethical obligation?
because it is one. It is an ethical obligation that people have to protect other people.
Okay, we have to protect other people, so protection matters, right?
Protection matters is a very abstract
Your
phrase.
Burns evidence indicates an ethical obligation, or I guess, the Burns evidence says that we shouldn't focus on autonomy, but rather, because that's an impossibility, but rather respect for persons. What constitutes respect for people?
Our evidence doesn't say we can never focus on autonomy. It says that in the context of disease management, it is better to emphasize respect for others. This just means like,
Right. So
sorry?
how do we know when we've surpassed the line of respect for others?
Well, there's obviously not an objective line.
So could you give me an example of something that doesn't respect people?
Giving someone else a disease that they do not want to get.
Okay, that makes sense. Why should we, I guess, the widow's evidence, what aspects of gender can be determined by DNA?
What are you talking about? What part of the widow's evidence?
Qualifiers such as gender, age, and zip code can be matched with linking DNA records containing further identification information. Given that physical attributes can now be inferred from DNA analysis, such as gender, blood type, and proximate skin pigmentation, it's potentially less difficult than one can imagine.
Okay, so a few things. We didn't read that part of the widow's card. We don't have anything to do with DNA collection. It
What?
relies on an outdated understanding of gender. We don't endorse it. That's why we didn't highlight the line.
Great, so how do you think about gender?
How do we think about
So
gender?
if you disagree with this evidence, how do you think about gender?
We don't think that we should be in charge of determining what
What's the relationship between
categorizes gender.
disease and gender historically? Could you give me an example of, for example, gendered violence in the context of disease?
There's plenty of examples of that. It's like a
Yeah, could you give me an
multifaceted and
example?
complex issue, which is why
Could you give me an example?
of gendered violence in the context of disease.
Yep.
Do you have anything like?
So like,
So explain.
the question of gendered violence is like obviously very
So
multifaceted,
maybe
and it's not like
homophobia.
there are many. Sorry.
Could you give an example about the AIDS crisis and disease, and maybe
Sure. You could.
how?
Yeah. So
homophobia
like,
and
so like
gendered
there was
violence operates in
there was
disease?
obviously a lot of homophobia associated with discussions surrounding the AIDS crisis. I agree.
Why?
We think that why was like there were a variety of social contingent factors that resulted in that construction.
One, then the case. You should have.
So you see the whole case was on one.
Yeah.
We all good?
Yeah.
You're good.
Alright. I wake
waking up every morning in this killing machine called America, and I'm carrying this rage like a blood-filled egg. There's a thin line between the inside and the outside, a thin line between thought and action, and that thin line is simply made up of blood and muscle and bone. And I'm waking up more and more from daydreams of tipping Amazonian blow darts and infected blood and spitting them in the exposed necklines of certain politicians or government healthcare officials, those rabid strangers parading against AIDS clinics in the 90s new suburbs. There's a thin line, a very thin line between the inside and the outside. This angry outburst concerns the precarious. There's nothing but a thin line between his infected blood and the politicians, lawmakers, religious leaders, healthcare officials, and other bigots who demonize PWAs and for whom Wojnarowicz wishes death. When terrorist rage is directed at those figures who attempt to harness the common in the name of sovereignty, force it into political forms of common, capture begets monsters, just as the drowning victim often unwittingly accelerates his own demise. So do we turn against ourselves, one another, and the world when we lose sense of the common only in a collective activism that Wojnarowicz rediscovers the sense in which he earlier had access. Wojnarowicz's political senses is formed in reaction to the violent suppression of the ontological heterogeneity of the common, the homophobia of society, those institutional forms that arrest the becoming and being common to mark an identifiable subject and administer imaginable population, set the stage for war of all against all. There are a couple of disadvantages to the affirmative. First is coercive consent. The plan institutes a massive health insurance expansion on the basis of non-consent, social contract theory, and foundations of the U.S. nation state are premised on the idea that valid social contracts are instituted through tactical consent, i.e. non-verbal consent through the use of government services. Not only is this a violent politics, it also implicates consent in the world of the plan. Single payer frames itself as a public choice, but is it really a choice if you're coerced into accepting? This teaches us to rat on those who refuse to consent to social contracts to align ourselves with the good and moral. The affirmative facilitates a mass crackdown on insurance fraud. Their internal links for solvency are based on unification of data into national databases that doctors, cops, insurance contractors will have access to in the world of the affirmative. The government would have legal impunity to crack down on those engaged in illicit economies. Anyone who does lab work and blood that tests positive for drugs, the government has complete authorization to issue warrants for that data. The government can and will plant evidence on sex workers, people who sell drugs, particularly queer people and black people and people of color, which opens up these people to death by the state. They will use health data as a reasonable suspicion to come into someone's house and arrest them for non-obedience. Cops are always above the law and should not be trusted to be ethical actors in the affirmative, since law requires law enforcement and people are deputized like the affirmative. There's also a financialization to add. Their solvency claim is predicated on monetizing care, the calculation and reimbursement of health services. The affirmative says that psychic and bodily injury should be computed and appraised for value, that our networks of care should be predicated on money. There's two implications. One is negligence. They inculcate a negligent relationship towards each other. When people come to us with injuries that exceed our reimbursement, it makes us hyper-focused on counting pennies, balancing up the ledger, and making unconditional commitments to give whenever we can and whatever we have from where we are from. It teaches us care is only when we can get reimbursed, particularly in the context of structural injury and dysphoria. They're never ending and ongoing. Structural violence is a cause of hoarding in the name of self-protection, because financialization is fundamentally about property relation. It teaches us to enclose the means of production, particularly intellectual means, in order to sustain market value. Teaches us not to give our skills to others. That creates a scarcity to retain the value of the commodity, which makes us negligent care facilitators outside debate. There's a sociality to add to the affirmative. Doctors, nurses, EMTs, pharmacists, and secretaries are not neutral, but raised and trained in a social order that determines gender variance and incoherence as a medical risk. Cisgender performance as synonymous with healthy existence. The common refrain, I don't care if it's a boy or a girl, just if it's healthy, gestures to the way in which white bourgeois conceptions of manhood and womanhood become the basis for defining health itself. Reaffirming assignation is not just valid, but neutral. The national nuclear family lays a groundwork that is then scaled up for national conceptions of health, disease, and purity. Non-conformity is calculated as a risk to the health of the family and the nation. Say there's two impacts. First is preferential touch. White cis kinship determines who we care for and who the social wants to touch. Alicia, a 23-year-old Pakistani transgender activist, survived multiple gunshot wounds and then passed away in a hospital when authorities kept her waiting for over an hour because they could not decide if she should be in the men's or women's ward. In 1995, Tyra Hunter was refused emergency medical service after a car crash because the EMT left her to die after seeing her genitalia. Sociality teaches us to save the white woman and child first. At the scene of the crash, and prefer to touch what is natural and human. The second impact is cisgender naturalization. When you go to a doctor to receive hormones and surgery, cisgender is rendered an undetectable force. It invisibilizes itself in trans-inclusive health practices through the rhetoric of trans people exist just like cis people. At the USC doctor's office, they make you fill out a checklist when you first arrive, asking if you experience dysphoria and if you are interested in medical transition. These practices are praised for being trans-inclusive, yet always naturalize gender assignation for everyone who checks no. The doctor always reaffirms cisgenderness as an invisible category that is healthy and normal. The affirmative intensifies the naturalization of cisgender assignation, and more broadly, cis-heteronormativity creates an insidious form of dysphoria. We internalize the fact that our bodies can only ever be what we are assigned at birth because we are told that is all we ever can be. It sparks a small politics of sterility that works to cleanse the messiness of transgender and purify the operations of gender ideology from the field of medicine. Dysphoria is a violence at the level of the intimate, which is also the terrain of health. It creates a violent disconnect between your body and the social order, a psychic and material violence that holds you hostage in a state of life and death. There is a conditional care to set. The plan forces reliance on medical professionals to determine what kinds of health should be cared for. Bureaucrats will control what makes medical procedures covered. Cosmetic surgeries, palliative care, homeopathic medicine are all the mercy of budgetary and medical decision making. What gets counted as medical care determines
What kind of care the affirmative provides creates a cruel dependency that single payer tells us it will save our lives, but it never tells us what they refuse to cover, which forces a dependency on the structures of governance as the only site of care. David Woodgenarowicz writes that at least I would arrive at my 80th birthday, the eve of my possible death, and only realize my whole life was an adaptation to the pre-invented world, busying myself with a process of distancing myself from you and others in my environment in order to know what I feel, in order to what I feel and find. I'm trying to lift off the weight of pre-invented world so I can see what's underneath. My friend says, I don't know how much longer I can go on. Maybe I should kill myself. I ask him if tomorrow you could take a pill and die quickly and quietly. Would you do it? No. There's too much work to do. Each public disclosure of a private reality has become something of a magnet that can attract others with a similar frame of reference. Such early public disclosure of a fragment of private reality serves as a dismantling tool against the illusion of the general public. If general public disintegrates, what happens next is the possibility of an X-ray of civilization and examination of its foundations. Each and every gesture carries a reverberation that we have to find our own forms of gesture and communication to reflect our needs. With gestures we can deafen the satellites and lift the curtains surrounding the control room. Thus we affirm haptic healthcare. Haptic healthcare is care without reimbursement, care that creates the conditions to refuse the police, the state, the ways in which social violence touches us intimately, and our abilities to care. Harney and Moten tell us that in our logistical capacity to be the means for each other, hapticality is the touch of the undercommons, the interiority of sentiment, the feel that what is to come is here. Hapticality, the capacity to feel through others, for others to feel through you, for you to feel them feeling you. It's not about who's holding you down when you try to jaywalk, it's about who's holding you up. This is the question of hapticality. The police can't hold what's already held, it's thin down what's already held. So you know that's our haptic institution. Revolutionary hands are held up not to the cops, they held up to us and holding us up. All this mass must look demonic to them and queer. It's queer to put yourself in such hands that they come to be held up by such hands may reach you just because there are no rules for access. Doesn't mean we don't know what to do. The undercommons is never elsewhere. It is touch is always a reach. Its touch is a rest, a caress. Hapticality occupies these rooms with a tap, tap, stroke, rhythm of love. Haptic healthcare is a different kind of reimbursement that stays in debt, remains open to non-reimbursement care that exceeds reimbursement, the provision of health services from our various positional and situational locations, the refusal to hoard and privatize resources, refusal to count pennies that we know when our hands hold coin. Haptic healthcare is trans masks and femmes pairing up in the 50s and 60s during police raids of gay bars, because we know that the revolts at Cooper's Donuts, Commons, Cafeteria, and Stonewall were not prescribed, but were just another night of homosexuals, gender variants, street workers, and sex workers coming together to check in on needs and desires, but also coming together just to be with. Halverson writes, the mission is to recognize that when you seek to make things better, you're not just doing it for the other, you must also be doing it for yourself. While men think we are turning to feminists, while white people think they may think we are opposing race, no one will be able to tear this shit down until they realize the structure they oppose not only bad for some of us, they're bad for all of us. Gender hierarchies are bad for men as well as women. They're really bad for the rest of the coalition. Emergency out of your recognition that is fucked up for you. I don't need your help. I just need you to recognize that this shit is killing you too. However much more softly, you stupid motherfucker. You know, case. Single payer facilitates global data centralization, which relies on the distribution of transfugitivity. Mackenzie 17, the data we are collecting around all people as the properties, nuclear waste, lifespan is longer than an institution that manages big data is nuclear toxic, consumer data use, national security intelligence, classic metaphors, structure for thinking, about transcendent management, identification data created by trans people, not dispute one individual change their name, although describing an identity that may no longer exist, builds on the fact that their SSN addresses, debts may be sold to third-party data programs surrendered by the users to the police or stored indefinitely in data warehouse, data safety indexes, managed with the 2 moments when their past selves in contact with a state that value may decay, but it is still capable of harm. Transcendent management is a clear temporality, user systems identification, people of the state and financial sectors, investment in data collection is a risk aversion, ensures that trans person's former name stick to that person indefinitely, emerging in unforeseen moments. While the state may allow some trans people to update their IDs, big data surveillance hides traces of a trans person's former identity to the present or make a trans person legal identity effectively invalid. The 1AC is structured by a logic of epidemic that incites crises of contagion in order to discipline and surveil populations in the name of public health. The political use of disease extinction as a spectacle mobilizes anxiety-induced governmental responses that fetishize the nuclear family as the basis of safe sex. They fail to theorize what sex itself does to contagion. Kagan in 15 rhetorical inflations produce generalized emotional combustibility and effective paranoid disease and an excitement to decrease surveillance and discipline bodies in the name of public welfare. Collective emotion evoke discursively brings publics into being. More realities of political action, epidemics, and various representations, systematic managerial response, and effective and already out of control, recognition of the limits of existing responses. Hence, a call for new ones, barebacking and bug chasing, called public safety into question, expose worrying subculture, calls for response, production of sexual activities, co-addicted to conservative interventions like law reform, surveillance, criminalization, mandatory reporting, and quarantines. Anxiety becomes mobilized around connections of sex to death and entails an increased fetishization of life as such. So this anxiety is connected to the regulation of sexual reproduction and promotion of the family as the exclusive site of safe sex, mandatory reporting by doctors of risky HIV patients to state authorities. Researching was established to scrutinize national clusters of infections, track down what groups or behaviors are responsible, creating a fertile atmosphere for the criminalization of HIV transmission. The logic of epidemic threats of perpetual revival of an anxiety that it seeks to control, including a crisis of contagion that spreads over new sectors of cultural life, which necessitate a regulatory apparatus, which then compensate materially and symbolically for the crisis it has produced. Sexual spectacle may function alongside public health responses, which could gay citizens prioritize health and the evil irresponsible embodies the transgressive pleasure of unproductive sex. The reckless in fact reinforces the myth of the nuclear family is the optimum social and sexual space, and all alternatives become correlated with danger. And risk becomes a template for creation of criminal class that justifies the mobilization of disciplinary and even militaristic forces. I'll mark it.
You get that?
Where it was marked, yeah.
Militaristic forces. Yeah, I got you. Okay. If I have tuberculosis, is it cool for me to cough on everyone else in the room or no?
I'm sorry?
Like, if I have tuberculosis and it's contagious, is it cool for me to cough on everyone or no?
Is it cool for you to cough on anyone? Our argument is that infection and the logic of epidemic emblematized in the 1AC is very different from that question.
Really?
Yeah, very different actually. You presuppose a spectacle in the context of the Kagan evidence of disease extinction and a crisis of epidemic that is incalculable beyond the models that we can create to track disease outbreaks. That's very different from asking the question of, should I cough on someone? That's very different.
Yeah, so you
Yeah.
have these cards that are like,
But also like consent, like.
Yeah, also consent.
Wouldn't consent, we would hope that you
cool,
wouldn't
gotcha.
just cough on us.
Fair enough. You read these cards that are very good about surveillance being, well, very good about surveillance being bad, but where's the card that says single variant does this big data thing?
So number one, if you want to solve emergent or upcoming diseases, then you definitely need to create a database.
No, we don't. You didn't read a card that said that. Like,
Okay.
The
just like-
entire evidence about DNA that you know linked out of is about how sometimes we need to stop, like we need to stop the preservation of autonomy because we need to have data and DNA collection.
Okay. Also, the
Yes, it does.
CNA evidence,
Yes, it
the
does.
CNA evidence says public health infrastructures in the U.S. are fragmented, which means we need to centralize them.
Centralize the payer, not the data collection.
Okay, so then how do you aggregate information about what diseases are emergent to prevent
You
them
don't
and
need
cure
to
them?
aggregate. We'll have a debate about this.
Agreed.
How does Haptic help? So like you have this rant about financialization and like limited coin and why we shouldn't have to pay people. How do
Yes.
you get doctors or experts to provide care to people absent payment?
Yeah, so the haptic healthcare that the alternative suggests is a good mode of relationality, seeks to understand that we are all indebted to each other, and we should respond to that debt not with attempting to get a credit from one another, like in the world of the affirmative.
Yeah, but
That
doctors went to like 8 years of medical school and they're like $200,000 in the hole and like they want to be paid. So like how do you get them to provide care?
Right, because the point of our argument is that we should stop finding value in money and instead find value in the care we can give each
very
other.
good idealist goal.
Thank you.
What makes you
Do you
think
not
that,
think that debate is about imagination? What do you think fiat is?
like, sure, I mean, we have evidence
Sure.
that says our proposal's realistic. I'm asking what makes you
What makes
think
something
on an
realistic?
individual psychology
Yeah,
level,
please,
people
what
are just
makes
gonna do a bunch
something
of free labor.
What makes something realistic? And it never said the labor was free.
What's
But
the
it's about,
exchange value?
it's exactly the thing, it's not about exchange value.
So it's not free, but it's not about value. I mean,
Well,
what-
the point of
is any of it
indebtedness
transactional?
Huh?
Is any of it transactional?
No.
It's like, if you like treat my cancer with your,
Our argument is that when you
helpfulness.
financialize care, it means we stop after financialization.
I get that, I get
Does
your
that make
argument.
sense?
I get your argument as to
We
why
stop
financialization
caring.
is
Our
bad.
argument
I
is
wanna
about
know,
caring in debt, about caring without
Yeah.
financialization.
how do you compel individuals who are self-interested to?
With our alternative. We have tested this idea, we think you should negate it.
We will try. 10 minutes. case and on the off case page.
Do you open it?
Yeah.
There will be an overview case.
You said case, then the
Yeah.
Anybody?
Pandemics cause extinction, mutations, zoonosis, are imminent, the survival of humanity, leadership, healthcare, and responsive, such as single players key because uniquely cements prevention and detection. Utilitarian calculations are a precondition of their sociality. Arguments, probability times magnitude, existential threats are infinite, even at low probabilities because of irreversibility that inverts their invisibility. Arguments that tail inverse probabilities is systematically dismissed due to a psychological denial of the availability heuristic, especially for pandemics because analysts inappropriately extrapolate empirics. Morality can never outweigh value frameworks, even if subjectively appealing are not universally held. The harm of killing those who disagree is indistinguishable from their warrant for why morality would outweigh in the first place, which is agency. Extinction is a floor for value because it lets everyone live to fight another day. It also inverts the warrant for why their impact matters, which is ultimately a just and avoidable suffering should be prevented, which the affirmative axis is on a much broader scope. That's the Pamela and Armstrong evidence. However, util is only appropriate at the highest risk levels. Balancing at lower threat levels solves the majority of their offense. It is inexcusable to deny somebody care in the majority of cases. That makes justice overriding unless at the expense of species survival. That's the Kirkwood evidence. Their first argument about surveillance. Our ethic does not cause surveillance nor biobanking. The Wendy's argument was about securing against contagious illness. Obviously somebody's DNA and individual determinants are none of the government's business. The affirmative reduces the results of privatized surveillance, which makes that surveillance less pernicious. Insurance companies are directly collecting the same exact information as the government would after the act, but they're using it for insurential discrimination, which is violent. Angerson 14 does availability of exposure absolutely so shopping and targeting developing details of social media. The machine only effects may be uncomfortable, but would reveal less than typical Google search evidence for genetic discrimination. Insurance could change in any time in places like the US where there is no single payer system. There's no impact to their surveillance. Viewing somebody is not violent. The impact of this argument is just that ultimately social processes of identity construction are folded into biomedical jurisdiction, but that is a straw person of the affirmative. Our ethical framework explicitly limits the reach of biomedical authority to physical, biological, and contagious effects. That overreach would explicitly be merely a slippery slope argument, which is not an argument against the plan. The endpoint of their logic is never knowing if somebody has an infectious disease, which is an obvious overcorrection. It amounts to a libertarian notion that individual liberty should be privileged above all else. That empirically results in tragedies of the commons and the underproduction of public goods. That's the widow's evidence. But surveillance can also reduce public health inequalities. That's a Fairchild and 15 ethics of public health must relate to a parity according to the individual. That public health system must be consequential because the ultimate issue of inequality and health public health system must make the principles of equality essential to the man's surveillance of course, of national principles, population well-being, equity, and fairness, and human dignity. Principles should provide for our decision-making. The ethics of health surveillance have begun to underscore the necessity of moving out the autonomy focused on several considerations of support requiring the protection system of relevant data. The importance of having comprehensive information in the scientific need to include all cases. The general ethical principle, the burdens and the benefits should be distributed across the population. Moving out the ethical principle, the ethical acceptability of the collection of data, the avoidance of harm to others may outweigh the considerations of privacy. The ethics of public health prevent a robust war for public health surveillance. Their Kagan evidence, it'll be answered more in the K proper, but there is obviously no link to their arguments about HIV. Having HIV is not a criminal under our ethical framework, even if it's misappropriated. Again, the permutation resolves that because the implicit ethical framework of the affirmative does not necessitate criminalizing somebody having an illness. Our argument is just that people should take precautions not to transmit that illness to others, which is exactly Barron's argument about how autonomy should be conceptualized in a relational sense, i.e. somebody having HIV does not affect other people. people unless it is actually transmitted to those people. In cross-examination, they said that it's not okay to cough on people without their consent. That is exactly how HIV should work. HIV should also not be transmitted sexually without consent. Giving somebody HIV without telling them would be assault and is obviously unethical. Now, the critique, intrinsic links to the plan are the only salient states and picks are bad. Confining the debate to resolutional parameters is critical to clash, which is a prerequisite to knowing if their argument is good. That means that any effort by the negative to absorb the plan or absorb the notion that a provision of healthcare is a good idea is a voting issue because it challenges the ability of us to, it challenges our ability to clash with their theory. The 1AC as a whole is not intrinsic to our advocacy. The point of having multiple speeches of the affirmative and negative positions evolve as the debate goes on. That process creates the possibility for reflection and argument refinement, which is key to our education. That detail-oriented discussion is key to our often Scalia 18. How should we in public academic health engage with the issue of racism and solidarity, ensure that the issue is informed in public debate, peaceful public statements, and concern always had a place in open society. The work of knowledge generation can help to inform acute social needs, developing concerns for statutes and just for the scholarship consequence of judicial lead and linkage to racism and health. The public has prioritized their research questions according to the health service of clarifying lines of action, elevating the importance of creating a society free of racism, making debates about tiny substance of our discussion, make debates still and hurts affirmative ground because the negative can win as long as our 9-minute speech is a flaw. They get all their speeches explained why that was the case. Our position has to evolve with extra depth throughout the debate, or we end up repeating ourselves. Now, at the top, what Jarnowicz's argument is, what Jarnowicz's disagreement with the notion of a public is an obvious overcorrection to our argument. Our argument is not that there is a singular public that needs to be protected. There are obviously a variety of publics. Our argument is not that the public has a unifying sort of goal. However, a precondition for any sort of publics or any sort of sociality to exist is the preservation of biosecurity. Bioinsecurity is inherently unethical because not just because it results in a biomedical infringement on a person's autonomy, but also because it can entrench financial precarity. Because if somebody doesn't have access to healthcare, they can ruin themselves financially as a result of that destruction. They can ruin themselves financially as a result of that destruction, which the government's intervention is uniquely capable of solving. That also means that we don't universalize any norm of what is acceptable behavior or acceptable sort of care, only as long as they doesn't biomedically threaten others. The securitization good argument. The plans, neither the plans nor the 1EC's performance of securitization causes violence, which is important because we can't defend every historical instance of somebody used facially similar language to justify an oppressive action. Our securitization is good. It's key to mobilization. Resources and publics are apathetic now. The plan breaks the deadlock. That's the Davies evidence. Either there's a hypodermic model of communication in which there's a one-to-one correlation between speech acts and behavior. If that is true, we solve the impact of their securitization bad arguments because our solution is anti-militarist, which is solid, or the public can refuse to accept the affirmative securitization, which is more likely, but it lays the foundation for preventative measures and makes publics easier to sway in favor of rapid response when actual outbreaks occur, which is the Cook evidence. All of their securitization and preservation of public's arguments are inevitable because they drop the diseases are coming and people respond to those diseases by fearing for their own security. Their only evidence is all about historical outbreaks, so securitization is inevitable when those pandemics arise. It's only a question of how we respond to those things. The permutation resolves their dissent. The affirmative does not commit to a set of healthcare practices. It merely commits to a model of who should be responsible for redistributing resources to ensure that healthcare can be provided to everybody on a moderately equitable basis. That resolves all of their offense. All of their arguments are about how doctors practice and about the type of care the doctors administer. The permutation proves that all of those practices are not an opportunity cost, merely that the government should make sure that everybody has access to them. The coercive consent argument, there's no link to it broadly because if a medical decision only affects the individual, maybe the individual should have absolute control over it. However, we are an impact under the residual link because being unhealthy has negative externalities, which I explained above, and their representations, even if accurate or descriptive in some context, can be reappropriated if their arguments about slippery slope arguments should be accepted. The affirmative in itself reduces social control because the status quo is means tested, which causes the government to surveil people of people's financial decisions and non-medical decisions, which is not worse. Single payer is a good form of control. Duval and 11 American healthcare permutates inequality without single payer. Many people don't have access to structure, but could be self-efficient. Dilemmas about politics can sometimes be beneficial. Having a yearly exam will fix money and improving quality yet are of all yet they're entirely non-violent. Being a doctor guides others to use expertise and authority to dictate ethics to others. The financialization link argument is wrong. Profit is entrenched already. Relationships are already financialized to a great degree. The alternative provides no mechanism to persuade other people to abandon that sort of framework. The affirmative care is unconditional. We think that people on an ethical basis should orient themselves to unconditionally take care of others. That was the point of our reading the Barron's evidence. However, the government does not operate on an individual level. The fact that individuals should care for others doesn't prove that the government has no role in redistributing resources. There are finite healthcare resources. There are literal pills that you have to take, even if there's not transactional interactions. There's a finite supply of goods, and the government has some role in redistributing them. The status quo power alignment means that the rich accumulate the majority of those goods, and poor people are left dying in the street from preventable illnesses, which is bad. Practicality matters for resource distribution. Cameron, 17 Medicare needs to include investments in affected communities, growth and federal employment. We need to be found in the same communities to shut down Medicare for all. Moral imperative. The urgency doesn't mean that we can forget about the details. Otherwise, we'll need to send them just single payers, aspirational substituting healthcare policy death. The fact that there are material constraints doesn't lock in a notion of financialization. The permutation solves because we can advocate for unconditional care in conjunction with the financial metrics in favor. That also answers the conditional care argument below. 6 that's all 17 priorities. Does not mean the rest of the scope also rules besides how analysis and differences between more dictated progressive health research is growing out. Many paradigmatic societies of appropriate will in favor of minority. We by no means take this for granted. Priority setting continues to consider wealth engagement, transparency, research can at the same time. A priority set in kind of market-based economy should be only protest until our opportunity to interrogate scarcity, bring fundamental change, or until former companies decide to change fair practices without adequate decision-making. Many will suffer homicidal impact solely long-term transformation may leave us morally intact, but realize the missing premise that it is possible to live without scarcity. This is naive in a world with limited resources and infinite demands. Instead of emphasizing differences, we should combine efforts to improve health forward. I deal pragmatically with the arguments about how doctors misappropriate care. Obviously, we think people who are shot should be given care regardless of their gender. The fact that gender has historically shaped those practices doesn't make it intrinsic to any part of our advocacy. They have not drawn a link argument between our securitization discourses and the way that doctors practice medicine. Single payer massively alleviates violence against transgender individuals. That's what condition as they seem transgender people who have needs that are not shared by other LGBT peers. The rate of attempted suicide is egregiously high. There's very perpetual motion machine in the healthcare system designed for profit. Lesbian, gay, bisexual people are less likely to have insurance than straight women. Bisexual and lesbian women are less likely to obtain medical services due to their cause. Justice in healthcare is one of the most important interventions in the elimination of disparities affecting the LGBT community. The research system must be eliminated in favor of a single payer. That card is marked at a single payer. Their haptic care arguments are not sufficient to solve. I did all these arguments about discourse being an ineffective remedy earlier. Reimbursement is haptic care without reimbursement is obviously compatible with the affirmative. The question of what we do as individuals is separate from the government's obligation to facilitate the provision of care. Not everybody would agree with hapticality at the outset, but the affirmative is a pragmatic intervention that facilitates the transition away from the commodification of healthcare.
Good. You referenced a permutation quite a bit, but what's the text of it?
So we think that you've made a variety of link arguments, and we don't think that your alternative of haptic care is explicitly sort of tied to all of those arguments. We'll make more clear explanations of the precise functions of the permutation, and we think those clarifications are good.
The piece of Duval evidence says, being a doctor guides others and uses expertise and authority to dictate ethics to others. You've forwarded an ethical frame in the 1AC, so it is accurate to assume you are becoming the doctor who dictates ethics to others?
No.
I'm struggling to find the doctor.
Sorry, I'm struggling to find the line that you're.
Duval, last line of the Duval card says the doctor uses expertise and authority to dictate ethics to others. I have a two-pronged question.
Sure. So this piece of evidence just says that there are public health. So the example that it gives is it's okay for a doctor to encourage somebody not to smoke for their public health.
Yeah, I'm wondering what expertise or authority derives from the position of a doctor that gives them the conduit to ethics.
So there are certain issues that it is good to characterize on a medical basis. For example, when tuberculosis is transmitted from one person to another person, there are many social aspects to that interaction, but there are also purely medical ones.
How do you
conceptualizing those is
How do you differentiate between the doctor who gives good ethics and the doctor who gives bad ethics?
Those are obviously contested. We don't think that ethics is contested. So I want to make clear, by the way, the affirmative never made a claim to a universal system of ethics that should apply in every single case. Sorry?
Nothing. Keep going.
So we read a piece of Kirkwood evidence that says that in the context of a pandemic, doctors should ration their resources in such a way that would maximize the number of people saved. We think that that is a good ethical principle, but the very fact that we're debating about it demonstrates
that pills are limited. Why?
Like there are literal physical constraints. Pills, like
Tell me what are those constraints?
Like there are a finite number of factories, and they can only churn out so much medicine.
Okay,
and society cannot output infinite amounts of stuff.
Yeah.
Which means that we need to determine how to allocate that money and resources. It's like, you are right, that is an economic logic, but...
You said redistribution matters and the state should do redistribution. The plan text says healthcare providers are paid for their services by the government. So are you just redistributing resources to private, or to healthcare providers?
No, we are redistributing resources from rich people by taking them their money and resources through taxation, and using those resources
money through taxation and
using
that to pay healthcare providers.
Using that to pay healthcare providers. Well, but so in that process, resources and healthcare services are given to people who need those services.
Okay.
So it's in effect a redistribution of wealth from rich people to poor people who
what
don't have access to
services, and who determines who are healthcare providers, and who determines what services are paid for?
So healthcare providers can include a variety of individuals. That can be primary care physicians, inpatient, outpatient care, hospitals, home care. I'm telling you.
You said can. I'm wondering which one's the plan.
Yeah, hospitals, inpatient, outpatient clinics, primary care, home care.
Okay.
10.
Are there any cards?
No.
Okay. I will quit staring expectantly at my.
You're gonna have to just listen to me.
I got no problem with that.
We're still listening, Judge.
Right. Yes, we are. There was such a flurry of activity there.
You fall through this falling asleep threat.
The tea is very strong. That's helping.
Someone close the door, please.
Are you playing a
Close
game?
the door.
I'm playing guitar, I'm like, but I'm just like playing on myself, so still wait for me.
I got you. Cool. Just the criticism? Cool. You good? The world is a killing machine and we keep on dying. Our alternative is both an orientation and practice of haptic healthcare. Remote and hardening hapticality is the touch of the undercommons whose touch is always a reach. Haptic healthcare is about making commitments to care for each other unconditionally. It's percent using the skills and resources we have from our social locations. We know if you know how to sew an arm, I have an arm that needs healing care for each other, regardless if you get paid. Haptic healthcare is a commitment to care outside of financialization, exemplified by drug cocktail collections and ADC development, medicine, the bodily cosmologies together, and mid-CCs outside of money. We have to stop internalizing the idea that we cannot do medicine by ourselves and for ourselves. The alternative affirms that we should seize the means of intellectual means of production, the ways in which pharma and the state make it illegal to care without degree, illegal to produce drugs that are copyrighted, begin from a position of non-ownership that flows each other with new capacities to care. That solves the affirmative. Haptic healthcare is about a destitution of what destroys our ability to love and care in the status quo and the alternative and the affirmative. We must begin with the destitution of the police and the state, which is there's two impacts that should bring our link arguments. One, the touch of white supremacy. Our link arguments about how the affirmative intensifies the ways in which power touches us before we conduct ourselves as per our Wojciechowski evidence. White supremacy makes us into pre-invented beings. It denies our agential capacities to build and love on our own terms. It takes away our consent to live outside of money, assignation, the state. The question of extinction begs the question of what life is and how we constitute life around it. The second impact, dysphoria. It is a violent disconnect between your body and the social order that holds you hostage to a state of life and death, i.e. your life can only be what it has never been. Balance cannot change balance, but balance does. Balance can change how we respond and interact with social violence because we are all implicated within it, which means if I win a link argument, you vote negative. It's not a floating pig. We are impact turning the ways in which you've decided for the state to redistribute resources. Rather, our argument is that we should distribute resources as a collective, as ourselves, i.e. the USFG should engage in haptic healthcare, the judges should engage in haptic healthcare, the world should engage in haptic healthcare. We think that debate is a place where we are able to test ideas and test imagination, which we think the plan that we have worked towards is one that should be affirmed. Our interpretation is that the judge should vote negative if we have one that the affirmative is undesirable to be affirmed. It cannot just be about plan focus because content always informs the ways in which the plan is affirmed. Plan focus debate causes us to separate ourselves from the words and privatize our link arguments outside of debate runs, which is exactly how the violence that we were speaking about get invisibilized and included from conversations about healthcare. That there's a thin line between thought and action. I hear Wojciechowski evidence that we have proposed different ways to think and live in the debate. That you should vote negative because it's a plan of action that should be affirmed. The sovereign common just had the affirmation that the affirmative attempts to harness the common in the name of sovereignty. The way the affirmative works to save humanity, save us from extinction through the capture and captivity is our link argument. The affirmative works to administer, manager a manageable population that in Wojciechowski's words set the stage for war against us all. The way they frame extinction first magnifies this link argument, i.e. cross it when I ask why present an ethical obligation to save maximum lives. Is our argument is that this link argument, that this interpretation of ethics fetishizes longevity of lives, i.e. it creates a visual lens that means to include the question of life itself. We spend our lives trying to save everyone, but do we not save ourselves from the killing machine in America, i.e. do we don't want to wake up when we're 80 years old and decide we didn't actually live the lives that we want? That is exactly what our link arguments are fundamentally about, how the world creates the world into business as usual. Our argument is that the affirmative extends privatization and reweaves certain good private goods into the public sphere, yet leaves in place the fabric of the private sphere itself. It believes that we are individuals, that we have public and private lives, that we are separate from each other. Moten describes the haptic is consenting not to be one, i.e. the haptic is a touch about closeness in opposition to the ways in which money and the state attempts to make us individuals that are separate from each other. The impact is that the affirmative stabilizes individualism because which causes us to be afraid of touch, of being with each other, which is clearly demonstrated by former epidemics, i.e. the ways in which AIDS crisis, people with AIDS weren't the people that didn't have AIDS didn't want to touch people who had AIDS. They didn't want to have them shit in their toilets. The affirmative extends the project of non-touch, i.e. which turns the affirmative private individualism causes us to hide our bodies from each other, to have sex with the lights off, to not share our bodies with one another. In other words, privatization causes disease spread because it incentivizes non-disclosure, because we do not want to disclose when our bodies hurt, to have lesions or have STIs, because we are trained to believe that they are private and that we have private parts. Our argument is that the alternative is the ultimate publication of goods. It's starting from the position of consenting not to be one, starting from the position with the critique of privatization. The affirmative leaves in place and provide a more potent counterweight in the ways in which disease spread intimately affects our lives. I do not think they haven't answered their course of consent argument. They have which opens up these people to death by the state. They use those health data as reasonable suspicion to come into someone's home and arrest them for their non-obedience. Law always requires law enforcement, which includes the ways in which the law deputizes people like the affirmative to manage domestic consent people, and places people who work in illegal industries into intensify precarity because they now have to choose to submit their DNA to the government or choose sickness, i.e. the only way they win the act is by convincing people to go to the care, i.e. early detection. Our argument is that you incentivize people not to go to the doctor because they do illegal work, which takes out the affirmative because it means that it leads to the spread of disease because they have to choose whether or not they submit their DNA and their health test to the government. There is also intensified by pharma and drug criminalization, i.e. the ways in which drugs are criminalized in the status quo. Testosterone, estrogen, and retrovirals are all copyrighted and illegal. Our argument is that when you make them outside of the state, it places those people into jail. That because people that are not qualified healthcare providers, i.e. the way in which the affirmative bans private health insurance. Our argument is that the alternative begins with the production of illegal medicine, i.e. the production of illegal medicine that resolves the affirmative. Prison is also a D-rule. They gain their solvency through placing people living their lives in a box. We gain our freedom in a world of the plan based on non-consent and non-agency of those who are incarcerated. Incarceration creates containers of death, which turns to containers of death. It turns out always the case because pandemics create death zones where the incarcerated have virtually zero control over health considerations. They do or do not receive disease strike. It means in the world of the affirmative disease strikes, it means that people in prison cannot leave. It means that non-consent, not agency or prior questions because they provide the grounding wires for which we think of our own choices as choices itself. This is also grounds for a critique of fiat because we come here on the grounds of non-incarceration. You want to affirm preserving the life of humanity by ethically allowing containers of death in the world of the affirmative. The impact is only certain people in the world of the affirmative. We're turning the argument about what is constituted by humanity and what they solve. The alternative results in the argument. We think that consent must be ongoing, verbal, first and foremost by creating the conditions for people to say no. You don't give people the conditions to say no to state owning their DNA. You do not give people the conditions to say no to the police. You don't give people the conditions to say no to the ways in which power touches us, holds us, and kills us in quotidian and never-ending ways, which is the touch of white supremacy. The alternative begins when we're in position of private queer agency. Since our lives have been taken from us, we must destroy what has been taken away. Why our alternative begins with the removing of the conditions such as the police that take away our abilities to live how we want to. Their argument about financialization, I'll do it here, where impact turning your understanding of taxes and your understanding of the poor. Their model of care is one that seeks to financialize and monetize care. Their solvency advantage believes that debt and injury are payable, that paying back some of the debt is an ethical obligation. They want to tackle observe monetary separation between the rich and the poor, but they don't want to let go of money. They believe that rich people should still own what they have, even if it's not as much. They want us to narrow the distinction between rich and poor, but they do not want to abolish it. Our alternative is one that posits that money is never a question of work or ethic or work. They're never something that we own or deserve. Money is always a question of assignation and inheritance. Instead of giving up some of our money, we need to give up money in its entirety. This is what Haptic healthcare and opposes indebtedness looks like. If fiat is about radical demands, and we need to begin making radical demands on each other to give up what we think our own. The link is, the impact is that the plan solidifies the reign of the white nuclear family, i.e. the alternative naturalizes the global order in which white nuclear families inherit the world, the nation state, with the police to protect them. You can say that, like for example, the ways in which white families have 12 times the inheritance as a family of color. Our argument is that it is unethical to affirm because you make certain families not in debt, but you don't actually give them the conditions of radical equality, which is an egalitarianism, which is our argument why the alternative is a better starting point for your terminal impacts. It also creates negligent caremakers because it means that we stop at the point of financialization. Once the doctor gets reimbursed for their care, it says that, oh, I don't need to do any more. It implicates us as debaters and coaches because it means we hoard resources because it stops at financialization. Rather, our argument is about caring without debt, i.e. Even if you do not pay me for example, care in the context of disease, I will continue to give you the prescriptions. I will give you the pills that I have. I will give you what I have in order for you to be healed. That's our argument about why we resolve the affirmative and a better starting point for the after the permutation. The word permutation definitionally does not mean combination or mutual exclusivity. It means a possible way in which a set of things can be ordered and arranged. The permutation by performance orders are alternative secondary to those permutations are always framed by the one you see in the way the ballot goes. Also to prove starting points are theoretically valid because starting points are a question of arrangement, not exclusivity. In order to win a permutation to function, they have to win that everything that should be affirmed. Permutation is separate and intrinsic. All it relates to the preservation of the one you see is the discursive and scholarly artifact. The permutation can only solve if it shifts in massive portions of the debate. It's the voting issue that makes it negative engagement impossible. If they get a shift out, it relates to they read the Gallup, he got guilty evidence. It says that we should know the consequences of prioritizing racializing in conversations of racism and how that's the alternative. They say we must redistribute. We question how you redistribute. They say that pills are limited. This is our final link argument. You fundamentally believe that there are structural constraints to medicine. That's what racial capitalism has taught you to believe. We refuse that logic.
All right, you good?
Yeah.
I want to ask some questions about the sort of utopian world that you imagine. So, in a vision of the alt, would the following things exist? One, the carceral state.
No.
It's gone.
No.
All
Putting people in boxes?
Right.
For the,
Yeah,
no,
agreed.
absolutely
So, law.
not.
Any notion of law. Is any notion of law? Does that exist?
No, because that's
Okay,
about
what
a
about
separation
money?
and, no,
Property. All of that is gone.
yeah.
Okay. You made a point at the certain. You
What
said,
argument has been?
Yeah. I just
Since
want
the 1 and 3.
Yeah. I just want to.
Yeah.
Okay. You made the argument early, sort of in the overview, that everybody has an obligation to provide haptic healthcare. One of the entities that you listed as being obligated to provide haptic healthcare is the federal government. How would that work?
I.e., for example, the people that are in the federal government, instead of passing the law of single payer, they should engage in haptic
Because
healthcare.
you mean that
So if they have skills,
the people, not the institution.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. So.
It's just an argument that yes, everyone should do the alternative.
Okay.
We imagine the
Fair-
affirmation of haptic healthcare.
Okay. Fair enough.
Yeah,
So.
fair enough.
Okay. So I guess then the question is, so like this negligent care argument, for example. So like in a world where doctors have access to a particular cache of resources. So like if the doctor has a stash of medicine, the doctor would distribute that medicine, right?
Yep.
Is there any unique value to that doctor's expertise? So like the things they know about biomedical aspects.
That sort of argument, yeah. Expertise is fucking awesome. People have skills, but it's not regulated to just doctors, right?
I agree.
Our
Oh,
argument
absolutely.
believes
But
and
people have
begins from the
different-
position
but-
that we have skills, no matter how many times that you tell us that we don't.
I agree, but every individual has a different skill set. Yeah. Like
But
not
that's
every.
also a constant of
So, like, for example,
dispossession,
if
right?
somebody- so
that the
if
world,
somebody-
for example, says that we can't develop care because it's illegal to do so.
Well,
like, does that make sense
the
about
le-
how
the legality-
your affirmative already disincentivizes us from producing medical cares in ourselves?
The
This is an
legality
example of
question
why
is
the
kind of-
alternative is
the legality
mutually exclusive with
question-
the affirmative, because you are.
Sorry, I gotta ask a follow-up question because
Oh.
I think the legality question is sort of separate to the point that I was getting at, which is like literally if you show someone a picture of like flesh that is infected with tuberculosis, different people would have a different capacity to make that connection, right?
I don't know what you mean by that.
Like if somebody showed me a picture of an infected person and like asked me to tell them what disease they had, I would not be able to do it.
Oh, you don't know?
Yeah, I'm not a medical professional, haven't been to med school. So it's
Oh.
like, do you think that's irrelevant to?
No, I think that someone should teach you.
Someone should teach me.
Yeah,
Who
they
should
should teach
me?
you without money, right?
Who should teach me?
You shouldn't have to go to school for
Who
that.
should teach me?
People that know,
People that know.
right? Or there
Like
are
the
people.
internet. I
in
should
the
look
know.
on Wikipedia to figure out how to treat people for cancer.
Our argument is a broader question about how we live and how we relate to.
It's like I
care.
understand that you've made an
Like I
attempt
know
to
you're like
democratize
I know I'm
knowledge.
just kind of fucking with you right now, but like we're making an argument about how care should operate that is fundamentally different than the AF.
Okay, sure.
The critique where X stop, and then the case.
So that's the doctor's argument,
Sure.
or it's just because I'm sorry. They jumped back up to the top, so that's
You can just quote me where they stopped.
they stopped. Okay, sorry.
We good?
Clear their cards.
No.
Can we just take a second? Okay. 5 seconds.
8:23.
Okay, we good?
I'll leave the sociality debate here. If I win it, it filters how their advocacy gets interpreted. Our arguments point toward a broader form of medical violence that cannot go by the name violence because of a conflation between health equals cis and trans equal courting death at X and the social sensory judgment in the doctor's office, the ambulance, the secretary implicates how a disease response happens. We're winning a prior argument about what determines the doctor's treatment plans, prescriptions, and medical plans. Our argument surpasses the doctor. Our theory of power implicates the doctor, the EMT, the secretary in a relation of say kinship that always calculates gender nonconformity as a risk and conformity as the basis of health. Trans people are not simply calling for access to healthcare. Medical care goes down in a social order that determines variance and incoherence as medical risks. Violence operates in the terrain of social kinship, i.e. the national nuclear family scaled up to the calculation of what is high risk for disease, health, and purity. The way the 1AC cross-sex handles our critique performative, the 1AC cross-sex handles our argument performatively renders sociality imperceptible. They isolate relationality as important but refuse to articulate the way that's recoded by gender. It's about a network of sociality that the affirmative relies upon for political coherence. Think of Alicia and Tyra Hunter, who were not murdered because of access, but because they were rendered not worthy of life. Their analytics for describing power are inadequate to describing violence, which is a disadvantage to the AF. The impact is a form of dysphoria dysphoria, which was not answered. In the world of the affirmative, trans people must reify scientific terms of art in order to receive medical access. For people who decide against hormones or surgery, they must now reconcile with the doctor always understanding their body as male or female. The afloxin of politics of sterility that works to cleanse and purify what trans is and statusizes transition. It means that trans people can only transition between FDM and MTF. You conceded an impact framing argument in the one NC that locates dysphoria as an intimate violence which should be prioritized in spaces such as debate because this space is deeply intimate. As much as we like to believe otherwise, why should we determine debate to be a healthy space for politics if we don't attune ourselves to the ways in which violence operates intimately? That's the only impact that your ballots can resolve. The critique points to a difference between providing care for trans people and eviscerating the category of cis in the first place. We have a link to the neutral framework of health access that the affirmative provides the conceded example of the USC's doctor's office where they make you fill out a checklist when you first arrive if you experience dysphoria, if you're interested in transitioning, visibilizes the category of cis in the first place. Practices are praised for being trans-inclusive yet naturalized assignation for everyone who checks no. The doctor always reaffirms cisgenderness as an invisible category that is healthy and abnormal cisgender is rendered an undetectable force in an invisible category that is healthy. The case page.
It means that babies are.
Oh yeah, it means that babies are assigned at birth and have to go through a traumatic and violent process of coming out later on in their life because they are always tied to assignation at birth. The case. Impact framing stuff at the top. There's no way to calculate the risk that is imposed from the kinds of coercive sociality that the affirmative performs. For winning, we are speaking in a place that has been indoctrinated with these modes of caregiving. We lack the language to articulate our own dispossession in the way that we dispossess others. The incalculability of what they presume to be an existential risk is more calculable than the incalculability of our risk, the risk we undertake together. If we want to link the affirmative about coercive sociality, not only does it implicate their impact arguments because it produces pandemic spread and the weaponization of contagion, but also that the question of risk should always go in favor of the negative because of the inherent riskness of the socialities that the affirmative produces inadvertently. Coercive sociality is infinitely contagious. You should prefer the alternative, which redirects our investments towards each other and not the institutional mechanisms that the affirmative naturalizes. It's also a reason to presume that the affirmative's impacts are less contagious and less of a risk. Even if they win their frame, we still win. Death comes in small doses. This shit is killing us. No matter how much more softly it's a tentacle squeezing vitality out of us, we don't know what life is like. Absent racialized gender assignation, it's stolen and taken away. Extinction presumes an objective and universal capacity for life that is hostile to relationality. If we win a link argument throughout this debate, it means one, you don't care about saving everyone, you care about saving yourselves and a particular style of living, and two, you create a society that is not worth saving, marked by apathy, fear, despair, and inertia, which has no value and replaces interpersonal bonds with consumers, drives that necessitate the non-recognition of other people. The data turn all to it here. The single payer enables a global centralization of data that destroys transfugitivity, medical records, social security numbers, addresses get stored indefinitely, sold to third parties, surrendered to federal government search engines. Data sticks to individuals. It's toxic. Identification becomes tied to data, and haunts trans people are chasing their former identity to the present. It causes a permanent tie to dead names, which was conceded. Paper trailing, misgendering in the doctor's office proves the alternative's model of care is preferable. The link is obvious. You have to track and preempt diseases, correlating symptoms, populations, geographically to predict spread vectors, and aggregating identification information to determine symptoms and cure effectiveness. You have to create patient profiles and electronic medical records to preemptively cure a disease or create a vaccine to that disease. The first argument is this angrist evidence. It's about Target. I don't understand why it relates. Obviously, Target collects data, but there's a unique link to the affirmative which centralizes data, and the federal government can issue warrants to get that data from doctors, even if those doctors own the records. They say there's no impact to it. The impact is linear because the affirmative creates a medical tie from the past to the future, and the government will have ownership over. They say it's functionally libertarianism. No, it's not. It's that we should be very attentive to the way that care is, and we should not make care contingent on the quote-unquote truth of trans people's identity. They say surveillance resolves inequality. This Fairchild evidence contradicts the rest of Anthony's 2AC about the public. This says there is a singular public, and that we have to replace the morality of individual rights with that focus on that public, which links to the argument that Wisniewicz is making in the 1AC. The disease, also the piece of widow's evidence in the 1AC proves the link. It describes the necessity to collect and aggregate DNA evidence. They'll try to no link of it when they say they don't read that card, but it's necessary to account for data in order to figure out which diseases are going to spread where. The disease framing stuff with a piece of Kagan evidence, it's fantastic. A logic of epidemic. The plan sutures crises of contagion to public health in order to discipline and surveil their political use of disease. Extinction is a spectacle that induces a generalized anxiety and lends itself to anti-black and anti-queer quarantines. Crises of contagion are structured by a sexual erotic anxiety that ties criminality to anything that exists outside the nuclear family. HIV criminalization and subjective quarantines in times of Ebola prove after the coup in Haiti in 91, refugees were detained at Guantanamo and forcibly sterilized if they had AIDS. If they had AIDS independently, there's a Ryan White, this had a young white boy who became HIV positive during a blood transfusion. That only after that was there first significant federal grants for funding and HIV/AIDS research. It means that when viruses disproportionately attack minority populations, and the government will not invest in vaccines or cures, which means that it increases the risk of mass death and turns the disease prevention impacts. The uniqueness for this link argument comes from your decision to validate the 1AC with your ballot. So even if they are right, the diseases are coming in the status quo. It's about the scholarly enterprise of the 1AC. Their discursive construction maintains business as usual of American empire building that is externalized outside the domestic confines of the state.
7:46. Do you know where he's going this game?
He's written. Yeah. It's the case. Then I'm going to start with some of the K arguments that the 2NC began with. So like the white supremacy DA, the dysphoria thing, and then the K in the order of like the 2AC. But I'll be clear about what I'm talking about. So it's just like case K. Anyone not good? Okay.
Evaluate impacts through a utilitarian framework. The impact of existential events is infinite and cannot be compared to other harms because extinction forecloses the possibility of any possible redemptive action in the future. Arguments to the contrary reflects hubris and psychological denial. There's no real answer. The fact that other things are bad does not mean they outweigh extinction. That's the Hamlin and Armstrong evidence. We do not link to their footnoting arguments. Util should only be involved to the highest risk levels that other preventable justices can. And to be corrected, that's the corporate evidence. Their argument about inarticulable violence of coercion is our point. We cannot calculate suffering, but we can maximize the number of people who do not suffer. It is incredibly colonialist and violent to allow a disease in the U.S. to spread and kill billions of black and brown folks in the global south. This is non-consensual and much more coercive than the scale of their link arguments. They say it's a world not worth saving that is totally devoid of evidence. They have not proven that nobody values their lives or doesn't care about catching a preventable disease. Those are still things that are obviously bad. The single-payer centralization of data argument is non-unique and wrong. First is that cops can obviously get warrants. Now the one in R says that even if doctors own the data, the cops can still get warrants to pursue that data, which means that it's obviously non-unique because private insurers and private providers own data. We don't change who the providers are, which means that cops would obviously be able to get that data in the stats code. They have no uniqueness evidence that says that private insurers are uniquely protecting people in the way that the government would not do. Second is that insurance is worse. Our card about Target is actually really good. It says that insurance uses that information for discrimination and insurential sovereignty so that they can control who gets what types of care and who doesn't, which is more coercive. Data is everywhere, which is the other part of the card. Yes, it talks about Target, but also other things, which means their data is circulating in the government's grasp argument is totally not unique because data is everywhere since it's 2018. The Fairchild contradictory argument is wrong. The Fairchild argument is just that autonomy is not individually constructed and says that just because it says the public does not mean it is one singular public. This argument is obviously silly. The plainest crises of contagion argument, the Kagan evidence is not qualified to indict every claim of disease extinction. It is a communications lecturer who does not review the empirical literature on the likelihood of disease to cause extinction. They have conceded the argument that there's a bunch of new zoonoses that are emerging that will kill everyone. They, insofar as we securitize disease, the perm solves the negative externalities in the way that would reify anti-trans violence, but security is good. The cellular evidence says that it is not militarizing when combined with public health responses, which means that we solve by advocating for a public health demilitarizing intervention, or that we prime the public for a more effective response, which is the Cook evidence. That's the double-blind argument that the UEC made that the block did not really answer. The Ryan White dissent is the final argument. People obviously should care about diseases that affect black and brown folks. The permutation would solve that by aligning an unconditional ethic of care with the fact that the government should provide and restructure resources. The K overview the white supremacy argument. There is no evidence that it is a permanently and unalterable structure. Yes, it influences some aspects of care, but we don't uniquely support it, and they have no way to dismantle the dysphoria argument. The permutation solves because the providers should not do dysphoric things in the future. They have read no evidence that says that all doctors follow a unique protocol that does dysphoric things, and no evidence that says that would persist in the world of the plan. The perm can combine an ethic of unconventional care for trans folks, which solves their argument. The sovereign commons dissent. Yes, we think we should save people. No, it does not trade off with them living fulfilling lives. This argument is based on one person's story where they woke up and they were 80 years old and they were like, I didn't have a good life, but that is obviously not universalizable, and they've read no evidence for almost any of these claims. The last argument is that the AF makes people afraid. The AIDS example does not apply because we only think that you should fear legitimate contagious diseases, not things that cannot be spread, which means our ethic would not justify fear of people with AIDS. At the top of the critique, they are libertarian neo-anarchists. There's no evidence that public goods are infinite and that the state cannot provide them. They have no evidence for their argument that money should not exist or that pills are infinite. These things are clearly silly and they need to read evidence to support them. I'm going to do the framework arguments first before I jump down to the permutation. Links have to disprove the plan text when we get to weigh the AF's impacts. One is clash debates about assumptions and methodology are infinitely aggressive. The AF cannot be prepared to prevent every possible component of the 1AC clash at least because skewed operation rationalists, all the values of debate. They destroy the dialogical process, which is an intrinsic good. The whole 1AC is not our advocacy. Our advocacy is the plan. Their interpretation incentivizes the worst type of cheap shots, which divorce debates from its true purpose, which is to have meaningful clash over a point of stasis. The second is logic. Thinking and acting are not opportunity cost. Logic is key to make any good decisions. Plain focus, bad arguments assume a caricature of topical debate. Debaters and debates can include discussions of anti-trans and racialized notions of healthcare, but they should connect to what a single payer does to make those things worse. You do not get to fiat the behavior of all people. No actor has the power to compel literally every person to change their behavior. This makes the alternative impossible to debate because there is no comparative literature. It's a voting issue for affirmative ground. If that is how they explain the alternative, the permutation, it is an unconditional ethic of care, but the government should pay for the services. Framing argument, no linked arguments assume the permutation or the combination of the plan with the alternative's ethic, which means that all of their linked arguments to the plan don't apply. The coercive dissent link argument was couched in terms of data and the cops getting access to people's stuff. That was answered on the case. The argument about the types of medicalization, the medicalized care, the perm can obviously include other types of medicine, and providers are shifting away from biomedicine now. The prison link argument, we do not incarcerate people. They have no method by which they can break down structures. They just wish them away, which is unrealistic. We've read evidence that says in the context of a single payer in health and health disparities, it is important and instructive to look at the practical ways that things can be broken down or built, because you cannot simply wish those things away, and they have no evidence that says that is possible. The money argument, this is like the pie in the sky modern monetary theory without evidence that money is infinite argument. It is totally baseless. Making people do free labor is also coercive. You have no evidence that says if I get cancer, there would be a wealth of people just lining up to want to treat me for no cost, which is obviously silly. The white families link argument, this was just that we're not egalitarian enough. The permutation can solve that through a combination of the plan's pragmatic first step with the alternative's unconditional ethic. The starting points argument and the no perms argument is kind of silly. Activists combine and refine methods all the time. We don't have to defend the entire 1AC. The severance argument begs the question of the links, which I'm answering now. The constraint to medicine arguments, there's no evidence for this argument, and I answer the majority of their biomedical stuff above. The argument that doctors kill trans people is wrong. Trans people have distinct health needs that are helped by a single payer. We've read comparative evidence that says that single payer gives trans folks the financial capability and the ability to get care from providers. Not a lot of providers offer care that is actually helpful for trans folks, but they require reimbursement to do so. People are not lining up to give those services out for free, which means the plan is net better. Insofar as doctors do discriminatory procedures against trans folks now, the permutation obviously solves.
And that's what I'm gonna do though. There's other things I have to answer.
Okay.
Criticism than the case page, but my computer word just shut off, so just give me one.
Is it back?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Ready now. The one here is too defensive to win the debate and heavily reliant on no evidence claim. I'm sorry, this is our link argument from the debate that, yes, our link arguments do not have evidence because our link arguments are fundamentally illegal, i.e. they've been pushed out of the academy. This is a structural argument about who has the authority to write, who has the authority to speak on issues of care and healthcare. Our argument is that they're alternative. Yes, it is an implausible, it is a radical imagination of a world that we want to live in. We think that debate is an opportunity to test ideas about what kind of world we want. What else is beyond besides the ability to make radical demands on each other in order to live the world that we want? Our alternative is haptic healthcare as an orientation, practice, and framework for how to do care. Haptic healthcare is to be the means for each other. Care is a means without ends. Haptic healthcare operates as a form of care that stays in debt, that offers care regardless of reimbursement. Hapticality is the touch of an undercover whose touch is always a reach, a negative ballot asks you to reach back out to us to care for each other regardless if we can pay for that sort of care. Alternative is a commitment to care without reimbursement. I will claim your leeches. I will give without redress if you have no money to let me teach you how to spot a leech. In haptic healthcare is using the resources and skills that we have from our positions to be the means for each other, no matter how many times I say that we will die without them. We have to stop internalizing the idea that we cannot do medicine for ourselves. The alternative says that we should seize the means of intellectual means of reduction, i.e. the ways in which pharma and the state makes it illegal to care without a degree, illegal to produce drugs that are copyrighted, beginning from the position of non-ownership, floods each other with the ability to make new capacities to care. That's all the affirmative. Coercive sociality must be attacked, and only the alternative does it. It turns and magnifies their impacts. What we call sociality teaches us not to touch our bodies, teaches us to privatize our private parts, to have sex with the lights off, to not share our bodies with another. You have conceded an argument about disclosure that takes out the affirmative. Privatization, i.e. the naturalization of the gender binary, causes disease spread because it incentivizes non-disclosure. We do not want to disclose when our bodies are hurt, when we have leeches, or have STIs because we are trained to believe that they are private. The alternative is the ultimate publication of goods, i.e. starting from the vision of consenting not to be one, starting from the vision with a critique of privatization that the affirmative leaves in place, providing a more potent counterweight to the ways in which disease spread ultimately intimately affects our lives. Consent not to be one. I love you regardless if you have money. I love you regardless if you have a body, which solves the affirmative, i.e. the alternative is about letting each other let us see our pain, i.e. which is a question that they are not foregrounding, i.e. in the world of the affirmative they give us access to care, but they do not allow us to touch each other, consent, and to live with each other, to see our legions. You concede an argument about how in the world of the status quo we privatize our bodies, i.e. we do not let each other know when we have disease. Our argument is that this means that people do not go to the doctors in the world of the affirmative, and they cannot feel their impact because they do not resolve the privatization of the body, which causes non-disclosure. Our impacts, the framework argument, our interpretation is that the affirmative, the negative path, the negative burdens of proof that the affirmative is undesirable. You've conceded the crackdown argument that the affirmative is not a benign move, i.e. rather all of our arguments are the two and zero conceded about crackdown, about how in the world of the affirmative people that do illegal trades such as sex work or drugs do not go to the world of the doctor because it means that their DNA has to be, the government has the ability to seize their warrants in order to take them into arrest. It means that one, it intensifies precarity because it puts people that do illegal work into more precarity because it means that they do not want to go to the doctor because it risks them putting into incarceration. You conceded an argument about incarceration is a fundamental D role because it's about decision-making calculus, i.e. the ways in which we think we have agency because of the non-agent, i.e. you only gain and save humanity through a way in which of the dispossessed by putting someone into a box, i.e. in order to save your life. It is an example of how your extinction first arguments is not about extinction first and saving lives, it's about saving a certain particular way of life. You also conceded an argument that also means that those sex workers and drug carters spread disease, which means it takes out your ability to solve the advantage because they do not go to the doctors in the world. The affirmative, the only option is I need a new timer.
Okay.
It's also proves mutual exclusivity because the state, you only invest in the state. Our argument is that, for example, you protect, yeah, that's fine. The permutation to the affirmative and unconditional care is the best articulation of the permutation of the 1ER. It's the new 1ER argument.
in which Sherry misgendered me in this round. Debate fucking affects us. Ballots are not just about plain text, they're about how we live outside of round. We have an argument about you choosing haptic healthcare fucking makes us feel better after the round. Fucking makes us care in better ways. For each other and for ourselves.
335.
335.
Yep.
We're good for that power.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Is everybody good to go? Cool. Impact framing first, the truth claim of the disease and existential threat is conceded throughout the entire debate. The payload and our strong evidence that the psychological incentives and the way that we think about existential risk and diseases are fundamentally structured. Our ignorance of the probability of those existential risks because of the availability heuristic as well as psychological denial. We fundamentally and structurally underestimate the risk of those things happening. All of their incalculability arguments are affirmative arguments because the risk of existential threats are the risk of existential threats and the fundamental nature of their irreversibility are statistically and structurally underestimated by decision makers who think they should be artificially prioritized. Obviously, they're correct. The coercion is also an incalculable risk to a particular degree, but our argument internal links is that on an incredibly massive scale, when the United States does not treat an illness, and that illness goes to other countries, and those countries do not have the financial assets and the medical systems capable of responding to that, and as a result, millions and millions of people die. They are coerced into death and coerced into a state of illness by a decision that was frivolously made by a Western power, which means that there's a fundamental ethical obligation to reduce that coercion on a massive scale. That inverts all their warrants of probability and neglect. It means that the fact that all of those are starting calculable means that the tiebreaker is irreversibility. Only our argument, only our impact is reversible. If their argument is correct, that we can always revert to a sort of cure or ethic of love, and that sort of serves as a backstop to the financialization of society, then you should prioritize our thing, because none of their arguments are possible in a world in which literally everybody is dead. Now, their arguments about prioritization are fundamentally non-intrinsic. Our Kirkwood evidence distinguishes between the use of extinction, the use of utilitarianism on micro and macro scales. If the entirety of society is at risk, then you should prioritize the preservation of the entirety of society. However, there should be an escalator clause, i.e., if there are issues of justice and issues of care that occur at lower levels, our affirmative has at no point disagreed with that, which no links the vast majority of their arguments. The 1EC has two central claims: the pandemics, which are existential, justify forcing people to act differently, even if they don't necessarily want to. I.e., if somebody wants to walk in and has a case of contagious tuberculosis and wants to cough on everybody, then that is a bad thing. That is a direct impact turn to a portion of the to a portion of the alternative. If somebody is untrained, they should not treat somebody with tuberculosis that causes contagion. There are particular risks that are direct and medical and cannot be mitigated without a particular degree of expertise. That is why it's important to preserve some role for the medical system and some role for doctors. Second, the second thesis of the 1EC is that the state has an important role in coordinating the response to that. Individuals might have an important role. Our argument was at no point that individuals should not provide care to other people. In fact, Berman's evidence explicitly made the argument that when you interact with another person, you have an obligation to respect those individuals. That was sort of established in the 1EC crossings when they were asking us about what respect is. However, the alternative's response to this is obviously ludicrous. It might be fine as a long-term aspiration, but if your strategy for solving global inequality and solving disease is to wait for pharma companies to give up their patent rights and for white folks to give up their inheritance voluntarily, you'll be waiting for a really long time. The reason institution exists in society is to solve collective action problems when there are public goods like diseases. The government needs to coordinate responses to them. We don't disagree with solving the following things. One, providers assigning gender at birth. Obviously bad. Our medical system does not need to do that, even if the federal government is doing reimbursement. We don't think that USC medical clinics should ask for people's gender. We don't think that drug dealers should be thrown in jail. We don't think that a pharma company should have their products be protected by patent law. We obviously do not think that people should never care for themselves, or provide health care for themselves. We think that there are obviously a lot of social relationships. We don't think that DNA collection for criminal purposes is good. None of those are intrinsic to our offense. They never made a connection between the discourses that we've constructed and the result of that. There's no intrinsic link to the plan either, because they conceded the 1 year no link argument. The only one of those links that was connected to the plan was the DNA collection one, but they conceded our argument that even if certain forms of public health surveillance are good, none of that necessitates DNA connection. A gut check, your primary care provider doesn't have your DNA on file. Obviously that would not be aggregated. That is a ludicrous assumption. The framework debate, they just extended their counterinterpretation with no reason why it's good. Debate might in fact has put its principal portability concerns developing strategies for change. In order to do that, it is best to facilitate that by weighing the implementation of their links having to disprove the desirability of the plan directly. They conceded the Flash net benefit. It outweighs all of the other impacts on a theoretical level, because Flash is the process by which all the benefits of debate are operationalized. We gain the most from this activity, which means that if we wouldn't heard that dialogical process, you should vote affirmative on this alone. Debate should not be a therapeutic space. You should not vote for people just because that makes them feel better, because on an individual level, everybody can assert that ballots can make them feel better, but on a more fundamental level, tying the spiritual well-being of an individual to a competitive activity fundamentally risks that, fundamentally puts way too much on the line, which means that ballots should not be imbued with that degree of significance. Instead, you should just vote for the team that did the better debating. There are infinite components to the 1EC that we can't be prepared to defend. Abstracting away from the plain text means that they can get off on top of any word, phrase, or method of pronunciation that we used, which they conceded was unfair. They also dropped our theory argument about the alternative. They dropped a theory argument about the alternative. Fiating individuals is uniquely utopian and bad, because no actor has the power to change the minds of every single individual, but one actor does have the power to enact a single payer, the federal government. The difference is that there's a comparative literature about single payer, but there's not comparative literature about everybody changing all their minds as well. This is sort of a gut check argument. The end point of their thing is like we should all live in a Marxist utopia where everybody cares for themselves, where private property is abolished, where everybody should share resources freely. However, even Marxist theorists argue that state was an important prerequisite, and that working through institutional reforms was important for that, which is sort of the parallel between how the affirmative works and how the permutation functions. The permutation enables the affirmative to step on the way to abolishing all of those systems, and because none of their links are actually exclusive, then because none of their links are actually exclusive with the plan, that means that the permutation is the best strategy for resolving those things, because it preserves the government role in taking rich people's resources away and redistributing them to people who don't have access to care. They consider that that is uniquely important and a prerequisite for access for trans people, even if they made the argument that in a world of unconditional care, all trans people would receive care on an equitable basis.
then if that is something that you can fee out, then you can also fee out the doctors in the world of a single payer would not turn away somebody because they are black and because they are trans. They would not turn them away or because they're afraid to touch them. All of those care ethics would be fundamentally transformed by the inclusion of the alternative. But that does not mean that resources should not be redistributed, because in a world of recalcitrant actors with sometimes occasional prejudice, while all of that is unfortunate, we have to develop strategies for the interim to allocate resources the best we can. The government has a role in doing that, and doing so and rejecting this has existential stakes, which means that you should not commit that fundamentally irreversible error.
Good round. Good round.
the negative from USC.
Fuck yes! Fuck yes!
I sat. I do think that it's pretty close. I basically vote on the permutation. I think that the K alternative is an operation of imagination, and so the negative imagines a world where we can care for each other without the need for financial remuneration. The affirmative permutation, though, is also an act of radical imagination. Are you okay?
Oh, absolutely. Please continue.
Okay. are you is this
Yeah,
happy or
it's
you're upset with
happy.
me? Okay. It seems that the app should get to be just as bold in their imagination as the negative, and if the negative can imagine fiat, a world where there are no prisons, no assignment of genders at birth, no inheritance, and everyone treats each other out of the motivation of a care ethic, then why can't the affirmative imagine how their plan would operate in that same world, which is what I view the permutation to be. And so it seems to me like the link to the financialization of the relationship between those who do the caring and those who get the care is sort of solved by that fiat process. I guess it's just kind of how you interpret the permutation, and so I think for me that those kinds of links and the links to how we view ourselves and what the doctors think and all of those other arguments need to be evaluated by how we operate in a world where they get to imagine that those things don't happen as well. So the question is whether or not there's a unique link to the harm of compensating healthcare providers in a world where everybody is already motivated by the care ethic and prisons don't exist and data collection doesn't exist. And I don't think that the negative really isolates one. Assigning gender at birth and putting people in jail and all of those things are also captured by the permutation. I think the affirmative does offer a couple of reasons why we might want to keep compensation around, though I think you could probably do better at this if you had a little bit better offense on that. I think that would probably be useful, but they sort of say that it can be a backstop in case there are some people who have such unique expertise that their participation in the healthcare provision might be justified, might in fact justify remuneration. They say that the state has a role in kind of ensuring that those who are providing the care do so in a way that doesn't cause harm. And they also sort of argue, I guess it was kind of in the 2AR, but they argued that it could be part of the strategy for making sure that we get to that world. So, I mean, kind of bottom line, I just think that a lot of the offense doesn't exist if I think that that they get the permutation. As for the debate as an intimate space argument, I am very, very sorry for my mischaracterization, and I understand that saying that it was unintentional is not really a sufficient explanation and is in fact part of the problem and not a sufficient reason for forgiveness. But all I can say is that I did acknowledge that it was wrong. I do still acknowledge that it was wrong. I did apologize immediately, and I'm not sure that you were arguing that my mischaracterization is a reason that I should vote for you, and I don't think that it is, but I do have a lot of respect for you, and I do sincerely apologize. Okay.
I can go. Honestly, I think the 2AR was just kind of bad. I think you can see the two arguments that turn the case and limit your ability to access it. Absent framework, right? The first thing is that the logic of care the affirmative creates makes people actively not want to disclose whether or not they have diseases, which stops the app's ability to care for those people and stop disease spread in the first place. I think there is something that the permutation might be able to resolve and do about this, but that's not very well explained in the 2AR. The second and the more devastating one is that people will not go to the doctor because they're afraid of having their information given to the government, which makes them avoid care altogether, the fear of imprisonment or that information being taken advantage of by the authorities to set them up in other situations. These two things means that even if you can create universal access, you cannot get universal care because people just will not go to the doctor, which means you will not be able to stop the spread of diseases. I think the 1AR is way better here on just going for the information already exists in the status quo and people can buy that shit now. Is it the 1AR but not in the 2AR? Which is why this link is 100% non-unique, which is not answered by Hex in the 2AR, but it's also not extended by you in the 2AR. And I think that would have easily resolved this being independent offense against the app that turns the app. I also think the Second thing is that like they just the second thing is like you probably could make an argument about why just covering the majority of people, not all people, is more than good enough to solve for the app. Like even if there's a small subset of the population that does not get care, the people they infect do get care, which would stop massive disease spread. These are like two things you could do to stop these links from like dumping a lot of the fucking app, but you just don't. Right, and I think that any of those two things would have made it harder for the link to dump most of the case, and they frame this as like an independent, turns 100% of the case argument. And I think that it's hard for you to leverage the app in that world because they just have a reason why people don't get care, disease spread still happens. Means that even if you win UTIL, you don't solve that shit. There's a risk of an imprisonment disadded in that situation as well as just like violence that happens to people because of the way that information is used, and you just don't have much offense to weigh against that because it turns the case. Yeah, there's also like an ethical D rule argument that's explained about. I don't think the impact really matters because like it outweighs because you're not solving most of your app. Right. So that's just like kind of the entirety of my decision. I think in the future, this argument should probably be a perception argument. It doesn't have to be about the actuality of it. People just have to believe this shit is true, in which that means they don't go to the doctor, right? Even if the information's already out there, people now believe it will be used this way because the government pays for everything, which thumps the entirety of the app because people don't want to get care. So even if they're right about the facts of the situation, it's irrelevant because people are just like, don't risk it. Right, and I think that makes it a lot easier for you to like actualize this argument. I don't think the alternative resolves 100% of the case. I don't think it needs to. But in the future, I think we can explain the alternatives like free clinics exist where people don't have to pay for stuff. Like there are doctors without degrees who actually provide people care, like that kid in Florida who was arrested for it because he was just giving people free health care because he just read a bunch of shit online, right? Like these things actually exist. They're currently illegal. The plan would make the alternative would make those things, I guess, not legal, but would like support those things. And that is a way that people can access care and solve most of your stuff. It's just you don't think about it that way because everything's filtered through the profit motive for you. But like these things outside of the profit motive do exist. Other besides the permutations, I don't really think matter because the impacts aren't very well articulated. Like the impact of the financialization this said, I'm not really sure what it is. And even if I was, I think the app is a move in the right direction of whatever the impact of the financialization dissent is. So like less time there, more time other places would be really good for you. I mean, that's honestly like the entirety of my decision. When the app is bad and doesn't solve itself. Yeah.
I think for me, the inability to kind of cleanly win the framework debate impacted my capacity to believe that the permutation was capable of overcoming some of the central link arguments. I kind of took time going through each one of the 2AR extensions of the impacts to framework arguments, and ultimately I just don't really know what I'm supposed to do with the impact claims or what the terminal consequence of those impact claims is. The first argument was a portability for change argument. I think that begs the question of whether or not the thing you are exporting or kind of bringing to portability is good or ethical, something that's asked by the link arguments. You make this argument that clash outweighs on a theoretical level. I'm not really sure what that theoretical level is or why that matters or what it does. The spirituality argument that it kind of puts their identity up to a test, a yes-no question, is sort of new to me, and I don't really know why their alternative is an example of that. It's a call for a specific ethic of care that is not about their personal identity, but about relationality between individuals. And I also don't think that the alt fiat's individual action. I think it calls or endorses the judge to endorse a particular way of being. And this matters a little bit for the permutation because I think that the lack of a critical impact is problematic for me when the negative is making impact claims about the way that you ethically orient yourself to this space. I think that the negative has kind of conclusively won that debate is a space of intimacy and relationality, that the way you have gone about endorsing your arguments in this round is one that partakes in communicative flows that kind of fix our notions of care in ways that cause people to hide their identity, to stay away from medical institutions, that don't allow for modes of intimacy that are important. And this is
is kind of critically important when I don't really think there's an answer to the value to life claim in the 1AR or the 2AR. You have this argument about different levels of risk association and the kind of ethic that is demanded because of that, but don't answer kind of the fundamental question of whether or not that life has value in the first place. You use the permutation to make an argument about how the affirmative in combination with the alternative is able to do that, but I kind of think that the negative's capacity to win, that the performative aspects of the 1AC implicate your ability to access the permutation, undermine the capacity for the permutation to function. I think the 2NC and 2NR discussion about medical expertise as an independent link does not have an answer in the 2AR. That constantly saying,
go ahead. Isn't that the, well, never mind, it's fine, you can keep going.
You go for it as an impactor, and I understand that.
Yeah, sorry, yeah.
Okay. I think they are making the argument that that undermines the ability to have a universal access to haptic relationality, because it fundamentally creates a difference between experts and non-experts and the capacity to access them. You might win an impact turn to it, but I think it undermines your ability to say the permutation is able to address all of the link arguments that flow from it, because it partakes in it takes part in like a communicative flow. They use a I don't remember the term they use.
What is sociality?
Sociality. They make the argument that it partakes in a sociality that kind of undermines the motivation to view relationality in a particular way. Okay. The financialization of care argument, I think that there is some defense that the plain text, I think that there is some negative arguments that the plain text as written is one that conceptualizes healthcare as a transactional space. I think the negative could do more to kind of impact that argument about why financialization is independently a problematic thing. I think that the 2NR does make the argument that financialization is something that affectively undermines the capacity to access the alternative as a praxis that occurs within the debate, i.e. your invocation of financialization is one that prevents you from doing the alternative as part of the permutation because you take part in the same sort of logics and rhetorics that undermine our ability to interact with others. I think that the negative is winning a sort of central claim about how medical knowledge is accumulated and internalized through social indication. I think that that undermines the app's ability to win how the perm resolves the offense, even if the plain is not mechanistically opposed to things like doctors not asking about sex, even if it does not partake in the compilation of medical data, it doesn't provide a motive force that would disrupt the centrality of medical logics that prevent kind of relationality between people, and I think that they have won that is a necessary condition for ethical.
I agree with what both of the other judges have said in terms of the kind of all the links and the solvency arguments. I think that Hex is really out debating you on those. I just think that the permutation solves those. I just think that if you get to be radical imagination, they get to be radical imagination, and so those then need to be reformulated in a world where they also get to argue for no prisons and all of the other things. But absent the perm, I agree that I think you're kind of being out debated on a lot of those arguments, and I agree with the assessment that the other judges have said.
And I also say I don't disagree with Sherry about that characterization. I think the difference for me is that I view their argument as radical imagination as one that can reformulate the way that we interact in intimate spaces. And the way that you read your 1AC undermines that ability.
Right, so you say the perm can't go back and redo what, and I see the perm as imagine them in that, yeah. So
I feel like we didn't really talk about the framework debate, but largely because I think the framework debate wasn't super important, because you were like, the radical ability for them to fee out all the individual shit is bad, but if they get to do it, we get to do it too. I was like, it's bad, sure, no one gets to do it, you'll weigh your app, they'll get the alt, but not an alt that like fiat solvency for every individual thing, but the weights turn the case. So like, I just kind of came down to like, you will win that you can have your plan, and focusing on your plan is good. I think they just want to disadd to your plan,
yeah.
right? But Apparently, the framework debate I didn't think was as important as it, but I guess that's because of the way I thought.
The links turns case stuff made total sense to me.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's
Okay.
Sherry, what were some arguments I could make in the 2 and C to help hedge back against the permutations that would help you in further rounds?
Well, I mean, I don't know exactly what arguments you need to make against it, but I don't think that the main argument, well, you made one argument of saying that you thought that their explanation of it was new. It wasn't the way that it had been explained earlier, and they kind of said from the beginning, we're going to wait until we understand exactly what your world is before we tell you what that is, and there was no real impact to why that, the fact that their explanation of it might be a little new was bad. And then you make the white inheritance argument, but I don't understand why white inheritance is an argument against the permutation.
It was just,
It just seems
the
to be
second argument that I had was the plan text, that your plan text is about reimbursement, it's
Right,
financialization, so it's the
correct,
opposition of all.
but that's why I said the way that I view the permutation is take that plan text and insert it into a world of care ethics, so that then your links to things, your financialization link and all of those other links need to be reformulated in a world where they also have care ethic. If that is a barrier to getting care ethic, there are a lot of other things that are also barriers to getting your care ethic, and you say we get to radically imagine a world where those barriers don't, and so they're basically fiating away your fiat argument basically trumps the link to the financialization. Just that is what I'm saying.
Okay.
In the same way that it imagines away all of the other barriers, it imagines away this barrier. So then you have to have a unique link to why in your world, if somebody got some money, why would it be bad?
Right.
Not why it's bad in this world.
Right. How do you respond to the argument that we were just law requires law enforcement? You can't just.
They wouldn't have law enforcement. They wouldn't have prisons. They are capturing all of that.
How would you ban private insurance? I know this wasn't an
I
argument.
know, but I mean, they're saying imagine our plan in that world where we do we operate with all the other stuff. That's why I said then you need to articulate what is it that having the money is going to make it all collapse? It's going to go back? I mean, why is it bad in the context of that world rather than this world to have the monetary relationship? That's what I'm saying needs to be kind of re-explained.
You can totally do better in that.
I think it sounds like you lost control of what your alternative did, and they got to paint the alternative for Sherry as imagine perfect world because the
Well, he does kind of ask that in the process. He says, will there be prisons? Will there be? And you say, no. And so he's like, okay, well, we can play in that world.
Yeah, and if you get, that makes sense. Like, if you're like, imagine perfect world, they're like, put plan in perfect world, everything else stays perfect, vote for us, right? And I think that's kind of what, I think that's kind of what happened. You lost spin of what your alt does, and it just became imagine perfect world, and they're like, put the plan in perfect world, all the other things stay perfect, sure.
Yeah.
And I think like, imagine perfect world bad, I was like, agreed, no one gets perfect world, because that's ridiculous. Was kind of where I came down to, which is why I think like actualizing what your alternative looks like and how specific versions of it, what it would do.
I agree
like,
with that.
You got to fiat some things.
The perfection of your alternative is what made it so that I didn't think that you got any of those link arguments that you made.
Like the fiat shit, like private insurers don't exist. We fiat prison abolition. We fiat this. It's not like perfect world.
We fiat that.
But like it doesn't.
It's just like we need to work towards that.
Well, you said
I said
radical imagination. Imagine a world where,
Yeah.
and so they say imagine our plan in that world.
And I think the unclarity of that is why you got Kyle, but you lost Sherry.
Okay.
And I was just like, oh, it turns the case this week. So.
Okay, I understand how to fix that in the next 2 months. So.
Okay.
Thank you.
Good debate, everybody.
Thanks.
Yeah, really good round.